Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir.
Bit of a threat there.
It is. We have some shocking news to share with our audience. And when I heard this from both direct and indirect sources over the last 48 hours, I was sort of gobsmacked with what's really going on in Australia, and how is this country really running? Because I think what we think is happening is not really happening. So obviously I want to protect some of the sources that I have, but it was brought to my attention, again through direct and indirect sources, that APRA has been placing pressure on members of the mainstream media not to talk about the issue of bail-in or the legislation before Parliament. The reasoning that was given was that talking about this openly would cause financial instability, and obviously the role of APRA is to promote financial stability. So they basically have been saying that this whole process has been counterproductive. Nothing to see here. Don't talk about it, and don't contemplate the ideas of one nation, because they're a bunch of crazy people.
Right. So there's two things there. The first is this bill, which is in Parliament.
Yes.
They don't want people to talk about it.
Yes.
Right?
Because talking about it will create more harm than good.
Yeah.
Even though it is a fact that this is before Parliament.
Yeah. Okay. And then the second is they're also taking a political stance.
Absolutely.
Right. That's pretty shocking, isn't it?
Of course. Of course. The role of the regulator is to implement the law. Parliament is sovereign, and Parliament is supposed to write the law and basically represent the interests of the public. So here we are, trying to educate the public through this channel. Now, one of the challenges we've had, and one of the question marks from our audience and the broader community who know who we are, is, well, surely Adams and North are conspiracy theorists, because some of the things they say is not talked about by the mainstream media. And it's fair to say that on a whole range of topics that we've covered over the last 2 years, I've made approaches to various members of the press, and you have as well. Yep. And what we have found on a lot of occasions that we don't want to touch these particular topics. So maybe you want to elaborate on that in terms of when you've approached the main elements of the mainstream media, and they said, whether it's the cash ban, bail-in, or some of these other topics, debt bubble. No, look, we don't talk about that. Yeah,
well, it's a consistent theme that I can say, John, is that where I get to what I think are critical issues, for example, the debt, the fact we've got too much debt in Australia and it's really hurting Australians. They'll go for the mortgage stress piece because that's relatively benign, but they won't go behind it to say, why is it like this, right? So people just say, we don't want to go there, right? I also tried to engage with a number of journalists before the Senate inquiry submission period closed with regards to this current piece of legislation, because I felt that this was a really important thing that they were exploring and it needed to have some attention. But no, nobody wanted to go near it until the submission period had shut, right? Which seems a bit weird.
Yes.
And I've had similar things with some of the other issues. So if I think some of the banking related issues. So a few years ago, I was on about the fact that banking fees in Australia relative to other countries are much higher. And the margins that banks get on their business in Australia is a whole lot higher. And it's nothing to do with wonderfully well-managed businesses. It's just that Australians are being screwed over. And again, I couldn't get anybody within the mainstream media to really get this and run with it, because they all said, oh, no, it's too hard, right? And in fact, even years ago when I was inside a large company talking about this same sort of stuff, I was actually told by my then boss to stop talking about this stuff because essentially we were upsetting the financial community, we were upsetting the government. So there is a pattern here of people interfering and not wanting to go into what I think are critical issues that are actually really important to talk about and discuss and get underneath to really understand what's going on.
Yeah.
It just goes on and on.
Yes, and I'm glad you used the term the financial community. Now, after I heard some of these reports over the last couple of days, I have had a conversation with an individual who has been in the banking industry for a couple of decades, and what was said to me was that this tactic of don't talk about it because you're going to affect confidence, you're going to affect stability. Apparently, this is a well-known tactic in Sydney and Melbourne to suppress any conversation on anything that's sensitive or controversial to the interests of Australia's financial elite. And that was obviously, that is so critical for people to understand. I mean, Martin, since I started this process of trying to warn the public about the debt bubble, many Australians who I've come across, whether via email or social media or in person, one of the common things I have heard is if something is wrong, my government would tell me that something is wrong. I would be forewarned about this. There would be some discussion in the mainstream media about risk, about problems, and I'd be able to take precautions before those issues come about. What I have, so obviously, as I've gone through this process, I've learned more about how does this country really work. And for anyone who thinks that if something is wrong or there is risk or there is something that you need to be aware of ahead of time, that's just not how our country runs. That's not how politics works. It's not how government works. And obviously, if there's any attempt to buck the trend, there's this pressure campaign. And obviously, where they can, they try to push you out of the system, whether it's pushing you out of certain corporations for saying something controversial, like you said. And obviously, I've worked at large corporations myself in my career, and obviously there was sensitivities about, you can't say these things publicly, or if you are a journalist reporting on legitimate news, you are counterproductive because you're going to create financial instability if you actually ventilate some of these important issues.
Yeah. And the point is that whenever this happens, actually democracy dies a little, right? Because it just continues this same process where essentially there is the real agenda and the perceived agenda, right? I'll give you a good example. I've had 5 people today contact me, on the old email and say, you keep talking about house prices dropping. There's no way house prices will drop. The RBA will make sure that house prices don't drop, right? The government will make sure that the home prices don't drop, right? And so they basically say, why are you saying all of this stuff? Because home prices will not drop. And I have to go back and say, well, actually, you say that, but actually there's a bunch of stuff that you need to understand. It might be quite impossible for them to stop home prices for you.
So, what I think the public need to be aware of is that the official doctrine of Canberra, of APRA, RBA, ASIC, and the financial community is we have an official position of mass ignorance. A lot of people have said that they have learnt a lot through our dialogue over the last couple of years, and people have said, why haven't I heard this from anywhere else? People need to understand that this is not just happenstance, it is a deliberate policy. So I would call, and you and I had a conversation on the phone before this recording, and I said, we have a soft, unofficial suppression order from the government that certain topics are not to be touched. And you think about suppression orders happening in third world countries, totalitarian regimes, communism, Nazism, etc. No, this is happening in our country, and one of the byproducts of this process of talking about bail-in, taking legislation forward, is we are learning how the real hand of power works in Australia.
Yeah, and I guess it's interesting because the things that they will also do is to just claim it's all a conspiracy theory. Well, we've seen plenty of that, or try and associate it with massive left-wing or right-wing politics. So not mainstream, it's right. Or other mechanisms like you get certain journalists to write a hit piece. Now that's happened a couple of times, right?
Indeed.
And it's not happenstance. It's all part of a process.
Of course. Now, in recent times, I've talked a lot about the movie in terms of the Matrix. So I think, I mean, a lot of people who watch our program have said they've tried to talk to their spouses or their children or their work colleagues or their friends and family barbecues, etc., about some of these topics that we're talking about, and they get a blank face. These things don't happen. I would have heard this from the mainstream media. If these things are really legitimate and true, what I think people need to do is, so I think a lot of our audience is awake to what's really going on, and so I think our audience needs to actually, maybe even share this show with more Australians to say there is something going on in terms of there's an elite class of people in this country who have a dialogue amongst themselves about a whole host of sensitive political, social, economic matters, financial matters, regulation matters, and there is a deliberate attempt not to disseminate those conversations, those deliberations to the public. And the consequences is people are unprepared for, particularly around economics, a hard economic environment. They think everything's okay, and basically, when things go bad, the elites amongst themselves protect themselves. There's no accountability among the elites. The elites, if they need to bail themselves out, they will, by money printing or bailouts or the federal government writing checks here and there, or state governments. But then when it comes to the little person who was not told a whole bunch of information, you're on your own. We'll give you a bit of JobKeeper, we'll give you a bit of JobSeeker, but then we don't have an endless endless bucket of money. So once that stops, you're on your own. That's not that's not a just democracy. That's not good government. And I would hope that through this conversation we're having today, we're going to bring some light on there should be never a financial regulator in this country calling the press and saying, do not talk about certain subjects. Because so as long as it's genuine reporting, as long as it's factual based, even if the regulators are not comfortable with certain topics being discussed in an open democracy, this is the system we must have.
Yes, and we research diligently before we make a show, and we actually do balance and weigh things up. We just don't go for the cheap headline or the cheap thumbnail, right? We try and get to the heart of the issues. But I think there's something else, John, which I want to. Do you remember I mentioned bread and circuses a few shows ago,
yes.
Right? And that's about the idea that, well, if you just keep people occupied over here, so watch Netflix or watch the sport, that's the Aussie thing to do, right? Yeah. Rather than actually look at these fundamental issues. That's actually what they want, because they can go off and do what they want to do behind the scenes, behind closed doors, supporting their agenda, right? So we've got to find a way of activating the broader community to really understand that these issues are issues that need to get their hands around them and get involved, because they're really important.
Yeah, they're really important, and they affect people's lives. And obviously, if the system is not going to look after you, you need to look after yourself, and we need to look after each other. And so obviously part of the ethos of this show is trying to help the broader community. Yeah,
absolutely. We don't do just for our own benefit, but to actually try and educate, inform, and assist a bunch of people. And in fact, as the community grows, we actually get more and more people saying, wow, this is amazing. And then they say, why didn't I ever see that before?
Yes. Well, I mean, so hopefully today we're exposing why. Yes. Now, so we've got 3 weeks to go on bail-in. Now, we're not entirely sure where this is going to go, but because effectively there is a suppression order of some description. Now, obviously, a lot of people would be aware that the ABC did report about bail-in in the last 24 hours, and so Nassim Kadem wrote a piece, a long piece, a fair piece, try to cover all of the issues, a lot of facts. And you know, we sort of mentioned in the last show that I spoke to her and she read my submission and she read your submission and she spoke with other people and no, she tested me. She said, okay, you've made a series of claims. Where's the documents? Where's you know where's all this FSB stuff, this IMF stuff? Show me where these things that you've been saying on YouTube. How can I verify these things? And I've been, you know, so I spent a few days with her, sending her a whole series of emails saying, here are the documents, here are the quotes. We try to present these documents to our audience, and so obviously we're ready to answer all the questions you have, and so that process went on. So I think that article is quite healthy in terms of informing the public that there is legislation before Parliament and there is a loophole now. Because we're not going to have any genuine conversation outside of potentially this one piece, the question becomes because obviously the government is saying, Treasury and APRA are saying nothing to see here, can never happen, conspiracy theories, all this sort of stuff. So the question becomes, how does the public judge the real intent of policy? So if the view is you can't talk about it, and obviously the banks and the regulator would say, well, if we ever admitted that bail-in was on the table for deposits, that would create material consequences for the banks, but also for the financial system as well. And they want to avoid those material consequences. So for me, and obviously, you know, speaking with the ABC, one of the things I said was, well, they'll never admit it, because of the consequences of admitting it. So how do you judge policy? So I basically have got 4 standards of how do you judge what's really going on. One is Australia's international commitments, and we've signed on to a number of FSB frameworks.
Yep.
What are comparable nations doing? And this is why New Zealand is so critical. But not only in New Zealand, but particularly in terms of the European Union. Yep. So now, and I should say that you know, one area where I did get some pushback from the ABC was that, you know, last year the IMF said that Australia should have a statutory bail-in regime, and so I was asked, where did the IMF say this for Australia? I said, well, here's the document, here's the page, here's the quote, and then the question was, well, every time I see this example of statutory bail-in, they're just talking about bonds. I can't see a reference to deposits, even though we have New Zealand. So when we had that, I was able to present some documentation and some quotes from Europe where they say, you know, we will bail in what they call uncovered deposits. So covered deposits is those level of deposits that are insured, but anything that's above the insured limit, that's basically on the table. And again, so you know, we just don't have New Zealand. We have Europe, where they are saying that if deposits are uncovered, they are on the table to be bailed in. So what are other nations doing? I think that's important. Modern and historical precedents. Obviously, this is why Cyprus is important. But obviously, in terms of 1892 is important, because one of the common arguments was, well, don't compare us to Cyprus. We never do this. Well, we've obviously done it. And then obviously, the other key point is, what is the current state of the law? And you know, I've gone back to, I've emailed the chairman of the committee asking for the opportunity to respond to some of these claims by Treasury and APRA, because when I read some of their technical explanations, they've thrown up a lot of red herrings that need to be gone into more detail to say, well, you know, it looks quite definitive from the government, but once you actually get into some of these explanations that they have, it's not as clear-cut as what they seem it to be. And again, that takes time to actually work through that material. So these are the 4 standards, I think, is if you start to look at their actions, what they've signed on to, what the law actually says, as opposed to what they actually tell you, you have a better sense as to what's really going on compared to the simulated fake world that they're trying to make you believe.
Yeah. And, you know, if you look at their submissions, they basically had bits of law here, and basically sort of tried to weave them into a pattern to say, see, we can't do that, right? But when you start picking it apart, you realise that actually doesn't actually work the way that they actually articulate it, right? And turn it around, if they really wanted to stop this from being a thing, it's simply just pass the legislation.
Yes.
So when they don't want to pass the legislation, you've got to ask, why is that? And just saying, we don't need to, is insufficient given the complexity of all the various interlinking legal pieces that they have to put on the table to try and justify their position.
Yes. So it's very interesting. I mean, even today, I had a conversation with a former member of federal parliament, and I also had a conversation with someone who works in one of the big four banks. And in both cases, they said, surely it's no big deal if they were to pass this law, because they both said, bail-in's never going to happen in Australia. So I said, I would agree with you that if this is never going to happen, passing this legislation would make sense, because you kill the issue, you give confidence, the law is clear, and we can all move on. But if they don't pass, the question has to be, why? I have a suspicion as to why they don't want this to pass, but we're not allowed to talk about that.
Well, I'll put this on the table, John. It seems to me that the best thing that they can do for financial stability is to pass the law.
Yes.
Because then people will be completely confident about deposits in the banking system.
Absolutely. So now, I want to end the show on a metaphor, and I think it's a very critical metaphor that we talk about is that when you have a society, when you have a country that has a two-tiered system where the elites are talking amongst themselves and doing nefarious things and concealing the truth, and yet the public is completely lost, bad things can happen. So obviously a lot of our audience would be aware of the Jeffrey Epstein situation that's happened in the US. And that's really come to light maybe in the last 6 to 9 months. In terms of the story and what he did, and he did it for look at those heinous acts. He did it for a long time. A lot of people knew who he was and what he was doing, and obviously there's allegations that very eminent senior people were involved in some of that activity, going back 2 decades. So in that situation, in the Epstein situation, you had politicians, law enforcement, judges, academics, entertainment people, financial people, people on Wall Street who were involved in this circle of influence, and yet the question is, how was it that the public was not told until the last 6 months that all of this was happening? Now, I actually found out about Epstein back in 2016. Now, how did I know back and then? So I learned it from in terms of this book. So this book is The Clinton War on Women by Roger Stone. Now, Roger Stone's actually important is because he's actually a confidant of Trump. And recently he was about to go to jail for supposedly lying to Congress. And his sentence was commuted by Trump pretty much with only a couple of days left to go before he was to go to jail. Now, he claims that, what he was alleged to have done, and the whole process of the criminal trial, it was all staged because he was coming out with books like this, exposing what the elite what we're doing in there. And so the first time I picked up this book and I read it, I mean, there's a whole chapter about Epstein, but there's a whole series of allegations about the Clintons in this book, which is just sensational. When I read this, I thought this can't be true, because what I was told, or what I was led to believe by the mainstream media about Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, their service in government, etc., couldn't be anywhere close to what this book is saying. And yet, at least on this question of Epstein, what is in the book is pretty much what has come out. So there are conspiracy theories, and there are people who say a whole bunch of false things that have no foundation in fact. But sometimes you do get people from these elite circles who become dissidents, who actually say, no, something else is happening that you won't know through official channels, but it's important that you know. And so anytime we have a system in this country where you have elites saying we will talk amongst ourselves, we'll look after each other, but the public must not know, and if someone tries to tell the public, we're going to shut them up, that is deeply dangerous. And I would hope that more Australians don't tolerate that sort of behaviour from whether it's APRA or other financial or political elites in this country.
Well, I just come back to the fact that sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? And really, there should be the maximum exposure and the maximum truth out there so that we get the best understanding of what's going on, rather than the controlled narrative and the restricted narrative that so often is put out there. And as you highlight, quite often those in power want to hold our power, want to restrict discussion and debate, want to actually spin and twist stories to be able to shape it in their own image, as it were. And it's the small guys, it's you and me at the end of the day, who gets hit over the head with stuff that we shouldn't get hit over the head with because we weren't told, we didn't know, and there was no way that we could have known.
Absolutely.
So what Interest of the People is about is disclosure, openness, based on fact, based on analysis, but making sure that more people know more about what's going on.
Of course. And the other point I would know is that, and this has been true for 2 years as we've been doing these shows, is if people have questions about our content, if people want to push back, if people want to challenge us, we're happy to take those questions. We're happy to take those criticisms. And obviously, if someone has a different view, we're happy to, particularly for me, I mean, if someone says you're wrong on this point or you're wrong on that point, I will go check and I will respond. So so people. So it's not just about accepting what we say. I mean, people, if they say we're wrong, will say we're wrong, show us we're wrong, and we're happy to correct the record.
Yeah, and that's the real important thing, isn't it? Because these sorts of long-form discussions are based on facts and information and checking of sources and all those things, right? And we'll admit if we're wrong, but people need to understand this isn't just a high-level opinion plucked out of the air. It's based on a hell of a lot of work and analysis. But it does point to a particular set of outcomes that really are quite disturbing.
Yes.
John, I appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you.
Martin North, John Adams, in Interest of People. We'll see you next time.